Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for U.S. History 1. Today we're going to start talking about American expansion and the growing problem of sectionalism. Essentially, we're going to talk about a couple of areas where the U.S. is going to add new territories to its boundaries, and in doing so is going to spark a crisis. As always, there are some terms that you should keep track of while watching this lecture, and some questions you should be able to answer. So, with that said, let's get to it. The U.S. in 1820 was a nation on the grow. The population had risen to about 9.6 million people. 1.5 million of those people were African slaves. The War of 1812 ended in 1815, leaving the new nation free to continue to expand. In fact, the war encouraged further growth. The War of 1812 had begun disastrously for the U.S. with the failure to invade and conquer Canada. The war reached its lowest point when the British captured and burned the American capital of Washington, D.C., forcing the President and the Congress to flee. Yet ultimately the war created new opportunities for growth. The power of Native American tribes in the region north of the Ohio River was broken with the defeat and death of the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. An even greater victory was won in January of 1815 at the Battle of New Orleans, where a professional British army was routed by a smaller American force. The victory secured American control over the Western territories. Perhaps more importantly, it left Americans feeling flushed with a sense of nationalism and love of country, and it made a hero out of American General Andrew Jackson. Moreover, with the addition of Alabama to the Union in 1819, there were now 22 states. With the exception of the state of Louisiana, all of those states were east of the Mississippi River. However, there were clear indications that growth would not stop there. Settlers were pouring across the river, especially into the trading city of St. Louis. In fact, things were so good that this period became known as the era of good feelings. Still, there were clear indications that the good times might not last. That is going to be the subject for this lecture. Let's begin with the good times. Excuse me. American expansion did not end with the acquisition of Louisiana. By 1819, many Americans were beginning to look for other opportunities to expand the nation's borders. The most likely candidate seemed to be Florida. Florida was still part of Spain's American Empire. Still, with the exception of a few forts and small settlements, Spanish presence in the territory was limited. In fact, the region was dominated largely by the powerful Seminole Indian tribe, as well as escaped African slaves from America's southern states. Both of these situations created tensions between the U.S. and Spain, and in 1818 those tensions would boil over into an international crisis. The trouble began a year earlier with a series of raids by Seminole Indians on American settlements. The Seminoles escaped across the border into Florida, and in 1818 the U.S. government sent a military force into that territory to capture them. That force was led by Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson was ordered to pursue the Seminoles, but not to engage the Spanish. Jackson ignored those orders. In addition to attacking the Seminoles, Jackson led an assault on the Spanish at St. Mark's. He also captured and executed two British citizens who he believed had been inciting the Indians in their attacks on Americans. Not surprisingly, the British were outraged by this. It was also highly embarrassing for the U.S. government, who did not seem to be able to control Jackson or his army. Things got worse when Jackson kept moving. He captured the Spanish settlement of Pensacola and declared the territory now to be part of the United States. The U.S. government did not know what to do next. Jackson had clearly disobeyed orders. Worse yet, he had brought the U.S. to the brink of war with both Great Britain and Spain. At the same time, however, Jackson's bold actions were extremely popular with the American people. Jackson, already a hero from his victory at New Orleans, was now an even greater hero. Excuse me. The man who figured out what to do was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Adams argued that Jackson's bold actions had created an opportunity that the U.S. had to take advantage of. After smoothing things over with Great Britain, he convinced the Spanish to sell Florida, because they obviously could not control the territory. Spain ultimately agreed and signed the Adams-Onee Treaty in the year 1819. But the acquisition of Florida marked the high point of 1819. Things were about to get worse, much worse. It started with the collapse of the economy. Back then, they didn't talk about depressions or recessions. Instead, economic troubles had a more descriptive name: panic. This was literally true as American cotton farmers saw the market for their crops collapse. Cotton was the nation's most valuable export, so trouble with cotton soon spread to other industries throughout the nation. But the economic troubles were minor compared to something else that was brewing on the horizon. The broad issue was sectionalism, a powder keg that threatened to destroy the nation. The spark that nearly set off that explosion was Missouri. To understand all of this, we need a little background. The new nation had, with a few minor exceptions, managed to avoid the issue of slavery throughout its first 40 years of history. Still, by 1819, something curious was beginning to develop. While all 13 of the original states had legalized slavery, that began to change after the Revolutionary War was over. One by one, the northern states freed their slaves, while those in the South did not. As we said in an earlier lecture, much of this was based on economics. Slavery simply was not profitable up north. The Louisiana Purchase threatened to upset the balance between free and slave states. Would the new states carved from the territory be slave or free? The nation initially dodged the question with the admission of Louisiana in 1812. Louisiana had been initially settled by the French, who had kept African slaves. Thus, there was no question that Louisiana would be a slave state. In 1819, Missouri became the second territory within the Louisiana Purchase to request statehood. Missouri had largely been settled by Southerners, who had brought their slaves with them. Thus, when Missouri submitted its constitution for approval, slavery was declared to be legal. The Constitution was submitted to Congress for approval, and that's where things exploded. James Talmadge, a congressman from New York, attached an amendment to the Missouri Statehood Bill. The Talmadge Amendment approved Missouri's admission to the Union on the precondition that the state import no more slaves. In short, Talmadge was calling for an end to slavery in Missouri. Talmadge was concerned that admitting Missouri into the Union would throw off the balance between slave and free states. Southerners were outraged by Talmadge's amendment. Nevertheless, the House of Representatives, which was dominated by the more populous free states, approved the amendment. It died, however, when it went to the Senate, where the number of free and slave representatives was equal. So, why is the dispute over Missouri so troubling? It has to do with sectionalism. The representatives in Congress did not choose sides in the Missouri debate on the basis of their political party. Instead, the division was purely based on whether one was from the North or from the South. This did not bode well for the future of the Union. Ultimately, the deadlock over Missouri was settled by compromise. The Missouri Compromise said that Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state. To maintain the balance, Maine would be admitted as a free state. Moreover, to prevent further disputes over the admission of states carved out of the Louisiana Territory, the Missouri Compromise offered another deal. All states, with the exception of Missouri, in the Louisiana Purchase, all of those states that were north of Missouri's southernmost border at the line of 36 degrees and 30 minutes, would be free states. So in other words, the line 3630, the southern border of Mexico, that would be the new boundary between slave and free. Missouri would be the only exception, the only slave state allowed north of that line. The Missouri Compromise was approved by a very close vote. Missouri entered the Union, and the crisis seemed to have been averted. While the rest of the country breathed a sigh of relief that the crisis had been solved, not everyone saw cause for celebration. Former President Thomas Jefferson saw in the Missouri dispute the seeds of a possible civil war. As he put it, the sectional dispute, quote, was like a fire bell in the night that awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union, end quote. Jefferson was correct. Within the dispute over Missouri were all of the components of the future Civil War. First, there was the sectional dispute that had been precipitated by American expansion westward. At the bottom of these questions was whether or not the U.S. would ultimately become a slave or free nation. This is not the last we have heard of those issues. That said, that's the last slide. And if you have any questions about this, please come see me or send me an email or talk to me about it in class.